Hello and welcome to another late night talk. I'm Stephen Aaron, and joining me as ever is the slightly tipsy Dave Wragg. Hello.
Hi.
We're here to talk about his new series. For those who have not read his first series, it is Black Hawks and the Righteous, and this is, of course, Articles of Faith Book 1 and Book 2. Go out and get them now.
Please.
And now we have his brand new trilogy, which starts with The Hunters. Dave is modeling the book here. There you are. Lovely, lovely, lovely series there. Starts sprayed edges. Goldsboro edition hardback.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So it's brand new trilogy. What's it about?
Well, that is an excellent question, Steve.
Oh, thank you.
I'm really
glad. I worked hard on it.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny how little this comes up. What is it about? So it's a fantasy western. It's part one of a trilogy, and it's set in sort of the wild, untamed frontier lands of the Serican Protectorate. So it picks up about 15 years after the events of the Righteous, give or take. Probably actually 13 years, give or I've got it all written down somewhere.
Somewhere. You wrote the book. It's all right.
The timeline is incredibly specific, just no longer in my brain.
Yeah, it's on paper.
So if you've read The Righteous, you'll know that lots of exciting things happen towards the end, and the ripples of those events are still sort of rippling, as ripples tend to. They are passing through, passing out, passing wind across the expanse.
Like me, yes.
Yes, yeah. We got to write what we know. So there are repercussions and there are ructions and all sorts of things, and we check in with a woman called Ree, who has lived a fairly sort of long and interesting life. She's about 42, which is suddenly looking quite young to me. And she has a 12-year-old niece, Giovanni, and they live on a horse farm, and they are trying to eke out a sort of a fairly kind of mundane existence. Ree's trying to keep her head down, and Giovanni is trying to get her head up. So, one of them wants a quiet life, one of them wants things to be considerably more exciting, and is actively seeking ways to make life more exciting in a perhaps not very well thought out manner. So it's all going fine. Everything's peaceful, except one day a whole lot of incredibly dangerous people arrive in the mad little town where they live, and it looks like they are trying to kill Giovanni. But we don't know why, and we don't know where they're from. We don't know who they are. And step one is just GTFO and survive. So the book is basically about a number of things. It's essentially a chase. It has been called a sort of cross between a cut and shut, if you will, of Terminator 2 and Fury Road, set in a Persian fantasy Western setting. Lots of crossbows, lots of explosions, but also the family relationships, the sort of the adult niece family dynamic. There are a couple of other characters who come along who have connections as well. There's a brother and sister pair who are looking for stories of their mother. They're sort of in search of their mother and her legacy, and they believe that Ree knew their mum when she was alive. So there's a whole lot of sort of crosstalk going on there, and there's themes. There are themes. There's emotion. There's excitement, but then mostly it's explosions and swearing. So if you've read my first two books, then you will know exactly what I'm talking about.
So tell me about the setting, because obviously, you said it's sort of Persian-ish. Tell me about the period and the history and the place in the world of your creation.
So this goes back to me being a kind of a giggling contrarian. So with with Black Hawks, I wanted to write something that was essentially a subversion of the classic quest fantasy. So that kind of COD, Tolkien, medieval farm boy goes on a journey, meets a wizened old mentor character, learns the truth about himself, overcomes the great evil in the land, saves the day. You've read the Black Hawks, you know that that's a kind of twisted mirror image of pretty much everything that happens.
Yes, to a degree, but yeah, go on.
Yeah, so the goal was to try and subvert things, and part of doing that was to take the setting and say, well, this is not actually Western Europe, and it's not actually knights in full plate riding horses and chivalry and swords and all of that. It is in fact circa 1250, between sort of, well, the Transcaucasian region, basically Georgia or something like it, in terms of the political structure, in terms of the sort of the history and the politics and all the rest of it, and in terms of the landscape. So I created a fantasy landscape that was rudimentarily, that's not a word, modeled,
it's sort of, yeah.
close enough, modeled on a Southern Hemisphere Georgia.
Okay.
And the characters over the course of the two books, they bounce around, as you may remember, and they go to quite a lot of interesting places. They go to the very cold part in the south, because obviously it's Southern Hemisphere, and they end up in the north, where it starts to get a bit deserty, a bit mountainous, all that kind of thing. And that is essentially them crossing the no, I can't remember the name of the mountains now, the actual mountains,
the Caucasus,
Caucasus
Mountains.
Yeah.
But in the Caucasus region.
I'm going to get it wrong. Yeah. So it's essentially crossing into the Iranian plateau.
Yeah.
So they are kind of entering the Persian region. And what I realized was when I set out to write a Western, for any number of reasons, the Hunters was always going to be essentially a Western, a sort of cowboy type, deserts
frontier,
and plains, frontier, especially the kind of the lawless region. Because one thing that I find it, and I mean, I'm kind of examining this in greater detail across the series. It was in the back of my mind, but I've realized as the series is progressing. So I'm doing the edits on book 2 now, and book 3 is part written but fully outlined. It's essentially in the background is a theory about like where the structures of the state are absent, where there is no higher power regulating behavior. Can we be good for the right reasons? Like, can we act in a moral or just way? And can we essentially create law for ourselves for the right reasons? And I think it's an interesting question, because it's too easy just to be cynical and just to say like, oh well, nature red in tooth and claw, humanity, they're all bastards to a man. If there's not a higher power regulating our behavior, be it invisible sky being, or the machinery of states with carceral control and a monopoly on state violence, people will behave terribly. And I don't think that's true, but I think it will vary depending on the circumstances and the personalities.
Yes.
So it's much less of a concern in the first book. The first book is essentially a chase with knobs on. There's quite a lot of excitement happening, and they are driven off into the sort of the wild. They start they're far away from what you might call civilization anyway. That's the whole point. Ree is, without wishing to give too much away, she's obviously in hiding.
Something.
Like, you wouldn't be there, right out there, living this existence if you weren't trying to avoid someone or something.
Yes.
That much is fairly clear. So that part is obviously blown out of the water in Act 1. But from there are then wider questions of, well, when you're so far out from machinery of state, how do people behave? Why do they behave that way? Is it just, oh, life is cheap, there's killings in the street, or is it that actually people find a way to make it work? Or do you fall back on sort of parallel power structures? Who enforces the rules, who makes the rules, who is the power in the region? And there is a group called the Miners' Guild, because mining has become a very important activity, and a concentration of power has been achieved through the wealth gained through mining. And because of the necessary enforcement of, protecting mining operations and ferrying all of the good stuff, there's quite a lot of what you might call freelance soldiery associated with their activities. And one of the great things about a concentration of armed power within a private structure is it can then be turned to other purposes, in the absence of a strong state. And again, I mean, without wishing to get too sort of dewy-eyed or wishful, book 2, which I planned for a very long time, I started writing last year. Yeah, it must have been very beginning of last year. So it outlined it, started writing it about January. Book 2 is a very thorough examination. It essentially takes place in a slightly further along, and it's about an examination of the limits of pacifism. It's borderline like, if you just want to live in peace, but you've got a load of armed dicks who want what you have on your doorstep, how do you square that circle? I mean, that is a very reductive expression of it. But it's essentially a continuation of that theme. Book 3 goes all the way on that. Is it basically like, what is the state for? How does it work? How do you, where the state has shriveled away to nothing, how do you essentially kickstart that and clear away what has grown in its place? Unfortunately, real world events have cast something of an unpleasant shadow over this. Yeah, so I was all of, I don't know, 6 weeks into writing book 2 about wouldn't it be nice just to live in peace without aggressive people on our doorstep? And yeah, Russia invaded Ukraine, which suddenly made everything that I was writing seem trivial by comparison. And the whole notion of freelance soldiery and concentrated power in private sector operations is a long running theme. And you've got like the bloody Wagner mutiny the other day of like, let's just see what happens when that turns inwards. Like, guys, I haven't even written book 3 yet. Can you just
give me a chance to actually write the book before we have it
Yeah.
acting out in the real world, please?
So as and when loyal viewers, you get to read books 2 and 3, please don't immediately go like, well, this is clearly just someone cribbing off the news. Like, no, I had the ideas first.
We write these things a long time in advance.
Yeah. So the whole series has so much that I'm so excited about, and really like book 2 I'm very excited about as well. But it's all set up in the first book. It's all about the characters, Rhea and Giovanni. It's about sort of lost parents and stories and secret histories, and fundamentally, like, what is the difference between a lie and a tale, depending on the complicity of the audience. Like, if you are told a lie, but you know it's a lie, isn't that just a story? And vice versa. If you're told a story, but actually it's true. So there's lots of interesting and exciting bits in the sort of the quiet moments between explosions and stabbings. I like to get one of those in sort of every 60 pages or so.
Yeah, it keeps the audience awake. This is what's for. Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of mystery as well, like the fact that Rhea is living on this remote frontier for a reason. As you said, she's in hiding, but then someone comes for Giovanni of all people.
Oh yes, well it's 2 different groups. There are
but that's a case of why are they after her? What has she done? Or more accurately, probably because she's only 13. Who's her parents, or who were they? And is she the heir to something? Is she owed? Do they owe something and they're taking it out on her? So there's a lot of mystery, as well as it being, as you said,
so there's it's a strong thread of like, number 1, what is happening, and then obviously number 2, why is it happening? And that, of course, is the question that sort of drives it all. Needless to say, Rhea has not been entirely straight with her niece. No. There may have been some information perhaps held back or otherwise distorted, which is suddenly becoming a little bit more salient.
As long as her surname isn't Palpatine and they change it to Skywalker, I'm going to love reading this book very soon when it arrives on the doorstep.
Yeah. Somehow it happened. Yes.
Let's not do that. Anyway. But because of the world building, some of the, and it's 15 years, 13, 15 years later from the first series, some of the technologies moved on of that era then.
Yeah. So as I alluded to earlier, the kind of giggling contrarianism that led me to the setting was one of the appeals was like no solid plate armor, no great kind of sheets of impenetrable like Agincourt style mail, no Henry VIII style full plate. Instead, if you've got money, you've got mail. And if you haven't got money, you're just making do with bits and bobs. Very few swords. That is a recurring theme in my original series. Something for people who are paying attention. Like, count how few characters have swords, like actual proper good swords. Most of the time, it's knives, it's sharp things on the end of sticks, it's clubs, it's whatever comes to hand. But like actual proper good swords are very rare. Now, the events of the second book have led to a reconfiguration of that region, which was known for its wealth and its silk production, believe it or not, and a certain technological advancement brought in from outside. So if you've read the second book, you may be familiar with There's a little bit of technology to do with blowing stuff up that arrives from overseas via an alchemist. So the advent of this, combined with some somewhat unfortunate effects to the silk production, have led to a bit of a reconfiguration of the Serican state, and its sort of otherwise collapse of law and order over a kind of its previous what's called the protectorate. So you've now got a whole lot more metal production. You've got a whole lot of mining going on, like the ability to pull ore out of the earth in ways never before seen, and also precious stones and a number of other things. You've got a lot of industry. It's, there are shades of like Two Towers and Saruman converting Orthanc. It's not quite that bad, but there's a sudden like, we can't do this anymore, but now we can do this. However, the people who are in charge or making the best of the new stuff are not the same people as who were running the show before. So there's been a massive shift in power, and that has come with its own costs, and it has again contributed to sort of the breakdown of the functions of state across the wider expanse. So there are now more characters who have plate armor, more swords. They're still a relative rarity, and in fact, I mean, it's something like, it is a bit of a recurring gag now in my books. Like, you might get one character who's wearing plate armor in one book, maybe, but the fact that characters will regularly notice the number of swords around and just sort of shake their heads and go, 15 years ago, no, there wasn't this much metal in the whole of the north.
In my day,
yeah, every bugger's got a flashy sword. Whoa, I don't know how lucky they are. So there's a lot of that, because nostalgia is immemorial, irrespective of the period. So it's really fun. Like, it's been a really enjoyable thing to dig into that sort of that chain of repercussions, because obviously, when you write Articles of Faith, always planned to be 2-book series, so it's essentially one story in 2 parts, which is perhaps why the first half ends quite so abruptly. But by the end of it, it was kind of, let's just blow everything up and never mind what happens afterwards. But actually coming back into it and approaching that world again and going, well, what did happen? Let's actually work this out. Let's think about this. And then seeing that sort of that chain reaction of like, oh, that's interesting. And that's interesting, especially looking to do something that was a fantasy Western, and to see you have this expanse of plains and of desert, something that is both analogous of like, the Iranian plateau, but also sort of elements of the Great Plains. And you've got a kind of the greatest sort of horse armada in history is, of course, the Mongols. But you've also got the plains tribes, the horse tribes of the kind of southern central United States, as is now, like the Comanche, who were absolute, and I think this is a technical term, horse bastards. They were the most extraordinary, capable horse people.
Yes.
And absolutely terrifying to the Western settlers, or Eastern settlers, both coming from the East. Who yet still continually came out there just to be murdered in the most gruesome ways.
Free land. How often do you get free land?
It's like, well, come out here and settle down. It's God's mission for you. Don't worry about the natives. They will murder you. But if you just keep coming, eventually they'll get tired. I mean, ironically, it did work in the end, but that's maybe it shouldn't have done. Maybe. Either way, separate question. But when it comes to the world building, there is, to have the opportunity to take a landscape like that and just sort of play around with it and go, well, we don't want to fall into that Dothraki trap of Game of Thrones. Like, no, there's none of that, seriously. But I do have my analogues of sort of the fierce horse people. You may remember the Morn, who were mentioned in the original series.
Right.
So they were always in the background. There's a character called Grassy of the Morn who appears.
Yes.
He's in the second book, and then she and some of her contemporaries turn up at the end as well. So they're all freelance by this stage, and the idea is the Morn have been gradually sort of driven back by the Protectorate, but then of course the Protectorate collapses in on themselves. So you have a resurgence of the people who have been previously marginalized. and oh no, terrible news for civilization, but where your actual civilization was perfect, nomadic pastoralism, like that's also a valid existence that
Yes.
doesn't need to be just chased away by like, no, we're farming now. Farming is better, actually. Like, for who?
Yes, a very
So
different styles of life, of
yeah,
the ways of life meeting, and it's
yeah,
not the inevitable wiping out of one as we've seen in history and other cultures and stuff.
yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff going on in book 3, which I haven't written yet. So who knows? By the
You're
time
getting
thing's
to it,
actually finished,
but
yeah.
it's
But it will be once book 1 is released, the edits are done for book 2, then I can get back to writing book 3, get all of this stuff in there. So it'll either be absolutely enormous, or I'll just distill it down to like 16 chapters. It'll be really short. And they all lived happily ever after.
and they all became horse lords and took over the plains.
I should say I am trying to have something which has a happy ending, in a sense of it is both an ending and isn't needlessly like, ooh, shades of grey, complexity, bittersweet. Like, oh, I mean, there are going to be elements of bittersweetitude, certainly with the first book. The second book, less so, but that's because it kicks straight into the setup of the third book. But the third book is the conclusion of the entire trilogy, and I have planned how I want it to end, and I want it to be a satisfying conclusion for all of the characters involved. And you're almost working backwards from that. Like, what do I need to have in place to have, this character get to the end that they deserve?
I've been doing that as well,
Yeah.
actually. On my last trilogy, I plan one as well, and on book 3 of the Judas, I've got like last chapter this character, last chapter this character, and I've written down the names, like chapter X, chapter Y,
Yeah.
and I've written the notes for where I want them to get to, and I know what the final moments are to satisfy myself and the readers, hopefully. And then I'm doing like the bit before that now, the plan, but I'm still like, right, how do I do this bit to then get to the satisfying ending? So it's, yes, if it's the end of the series, it's the end of everything. You need to have
you can't come back and sort of pick up and like, PS, also they they got a motorbike, and we haven't invented motorbikes yet, but I am tweaking the technology to see. I mean, again, it's like, this is not serious historical fantasy about Persia in 1263. I know where you can get some. Yeah, I know a guy.
It's fictional as well.
Yeah.
Like, there's weird stuff in there that's not real, and so historians need to lie down and have a cup of tea.
It is like,
I remember that
historical fantasy.
It is fantasy. Yeah.
Yes. The two things. There's two concepts here, and you're going to need to wrap your brain around both of them, I'm afraid. But
like if I'd put dragons in there, great, I could have done that. But then suddenly it's not really historical fantasy; it's just fantasy.
Yeah,
I didn't really want to do that.
That kind of, I mean, who's it? Shauna Lawless.
Yep,
she's done that with the full title is Children of Gods and Fighting Men.
Book 2
is. Well, you've got book 2. Oh, Words of Kings of Profit. Yeah.
Oh,
get it now, kids.
Pays to know people.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shauna.
but yes, that's another classic example, isn't it? Of like, all of this could have happened.
Yep.
But also these little bits in the margins. Yeah. You don't know it didn't. How are you going to prove a negative? Prove that it wasn't magic.
Exactly.
Yeah. Harder with dragons.
What I like about your books is that you have some of the fantasy framework that you're telling particular stories. You said there's a girl on the run with an aunt, and there's stuff going on, but clearly there's all of this world building and other things that's going on where you're talking about much bigger things. And I always say there's the story, and then there's what the book is about. And it's very clearly you've got both things going on. And some people just read the story and enjoy it. Great, fine. If you get the stuff about what it's about as well, that's the most rewarding for me.
I think so. And it's weird because I think when you're kind of a new or a young writer or whatever else, I think you will be seized by one or the other, but probably not both. And I know that there are people who are kind of, I am going to write a book and it's going to be about all of these big things. It's going to be about this, and this. And there are people like me who are like, I'm going to write a book, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and then they're going to explode, and it's going to be so cool. Right. And what is the book about? Well, it's about the thing that explodes. Like, how does the thing that explodes feel about the fact it explodes? Like, oh yes. I don't really know. But because we're all human, like the human brain is wired for stories. We're inveterate storytellers, both in sort of groups and as individuals. And that, believe it or not, it's a theme of this book is the need to tell stories and all the rest of it. One of the characters is a born storyteller, at least as he keeps telling people. I do like to base characters on myself, of course. Yeah. He's extremely verbose as well. But we are, with our writing, we are writing about things, whether we're aware of it or not. And like our own brain chemistry, the shape of our brains and the sort of the memories and the neurons and everything else, they are wired in the way that makes us us. And I don't think two people would tell the same story, the same problem, exactly the same way. Even if they were identical twins, they might even have different perspectives on it. But you might not think, I wrote a book about a thing that exploded. Like, yeah, but deep down, you were probably there was still something in there. And I think the ability to be able to draw that out and to take a step back and realize what it is you're trying to do as you're doing it is a sign that you've perhaps taken a step forward as a writer, or you've developed along that path. That kind of,
yeah.
I think I know what this is about now. But often you have to write the entire book and be like, what have I been trying to tell myself? And I know, I mean, the Black Hawks and the Righteous are about like lost fathers. That is fundamentally about his Chell's search for a father figure, but also the fact that most of the people he meant did not have fathers as well. So there's sort of mutual reinforcement at various points. But that's the thing that sort of powers it through, like that kind of that need to live up to his own dad's image as he perceived him, and the realization that actually the notion that you have, if your dad dies when you're 8, you probably don't have a fully rounded understanding of who he was as a person.
No.
And that realization is a large part of sort of Chell's own journey, as well as understanding that just because the ideals you're trying to live up to aren't necessarily based on a solid foundation doesn't mean they aren't worth living up to. But if you'd asked me before I'd written the thing, what's it about? I'd have gone, it's about a guy who gets his arm dislocated in chapter 3 and then spends the next sort of 250,000 words going, oh, my shoulder hurts.
I think you're right. I think some of it comes in the doing. I think some of it comes from having an editor who can take that step back, read it and say, oh, I see what you're doing here. But then you've gone down this dark alley and you're like, is that what I was doing?
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. And then, oh yeah, that bit doesn't work. But I think taking it requires someone who can take that step back, because you spend so long with your nose in the book, essentially working on it, that I struggle to have that distance from my own work. I need someone who can be this extra pair of eyes and say, this bit doesn't work and these are the reasons why. And you go, you're right. But it's so hard to do. Even now, after so many books, I'm still that kind of thing of where I'm so invested in the book, I'm so deep in it. It just takes me a while to come up for air, really, and see the differences.
And some of it, I think you can almost sort of rubber duck your way through. You can almost, trying to explain to a rubber duck what this book is about. And the act of actually saying the words out loud may force your brain to sort of reconcile a whole lot of kind of disparate thoughts into a coherent whole and say, oh, right, what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to tell a story. Well, so with the Hunters, having done Lost Fathers with the first series, this one is Lost Mothers, like well, at least for this book, at least. It is about, Giovanni's search for her own identity and all the various other things that go with that. So that I was fairly clear about, because when I set out to write the book, like who's going to be in it, that's the fundamental thing. So I knew that was going to be in there. But then in terms of sort of the Akian and Ash characters, the brother and sister couple who arrive, they're not a couple, who appear in the story. They are looking for, they were looking for their mother. She is no longer around, but now they're looking for people who knew her. And so their kind of narrative hits the other one going the other way. With hilarious consequences. But again, that is a deliberate part by me, to sort of drive the narrative, match the theme. But that doesn't mean that it was A, easy, or B, particularly well planned. It's just that because at one point there was one stage of the edits where those two were not going to be in it. It was, the first bit of editorial feedback I had was, you've got too many plot strands going and we need to lose one. Why don't we lose the siblings? And I was a bit, okay. So started to go through the editing process of like remove them and replace them with this other character. And I got halfway through the book and I can't do this. I'm making the book worse. Like every scene I remove them from gets weaker as a result, because you're losing the counterpoint. You're losing the ability, especially when you've got a character like Aki, who is someone who will put the most poetic and thematic version of anything and will broadcast his thoughts at top volume. And like, this is a very useful character to have if ever you want to just bellow what the theme of a scene is. So yeah, we went back and undid those changes and then dropped the other character and brought, because originally Aki and Ash didn't appear until part way in. They traveled sort of in separately. So now they are in from the beginning, integrated. So it's a little bit of trivia there. And it did, like the early phases of the book were buggered about, reorganized, reordered. Certainly. I mean, originally I had interleaving point of view, sort of scene, was told it was confusing. So instead it's kind of big block of this, then big block of this, then big block of this.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure. I feel like it loses a bit of tension from that, but it also helps readers understand who people are, where they are in relation to each other, and where they're going, which is apparently important.
Yeah.
But I still feel like it's for interpretation, and I will be interested to hear when people read it if they think like, if it hadn't been just a big block of this point of view and a big block of this point of view, if it had been interleaved, would it have changed it? How would he felt about it?
So, interesting. Yeah, we'll see. Okay. Interesting to see what people say.
Yeah.
Well, The Hunters is out on
the 20th of July.
Yeah. Right. So it's days away now. So we recommend that you go and order yourself. There you go. Go and order yourself a copy. You can get copies from A Broken Binding, and of course all local bookshops from wherever you are in the world. So I should say thanks to Dave coming to joining us tonight and telling us all about The Hunters. And
thank you very much for having me and letting me just do that the whole time.
My absolute pleasure, making very easy my job. Very easy my job.
Thank you, Steve.
All right,
You're
everyone.
a gentleman.
Good night, everyone. Good night.